Hello. So I wanted to make a real quick video to break up mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism into a few different smaller bits. I'm going to start off this one with a video on just generally describing what community ecology is, um, kind of continuing some of the tables that we've talked about previously in terms of summarizing interactions, and then this video will also cover some of the diversity of the kinds of parasitism that's out there. So, as you remember, community ecology is when we have interactions between different species within a community. And in class, we've already talked about competition, where two species have a negative impact on each other in terms of the fitness that they have on each other. And then there's also negative impacts of predators. The predator benefits, but the prey is negatively impacted in a successful predation event, and we've talked about that briefly. Today we're going to talk about symbiosis. Now, a lot of people think that symbiosis is synonymous or means the same thing as mutualism, but that's not really true. A symbiotic relationship is one that involves a very intimate association or relationship between two or more species. So it's a long-term relationship where two species are very closely intertwined in how they interact. There are three examples listed below: parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism, and that's what we're going to be talking about in a lot of today's topics. But you could also imagine where competitors could be symbiotic or predators could be symbiotic. And all of this comes about through a process known as coevolution. Coevolution occurs when a series of cycles happen between two or more species, where one species influences the other species, and vice versa. So changes in species A lead to changes in species B, and changes in species B lead to changes in species A. And so a lot of these kinds of symbiotic relationships are the outcome of long-term coevolution. So today we're going to talk about, this is just a brief outline, we're going to talk about parasitism, a case where one species benefits at the expense of the other species. Mutualism, where both species together benefit because of the presence of the other species. And commensalism, where one species benefits but the other species doesn't really have any positive or negative impact on it. Now, I've said this before, but I want to emphasize it again. These pluses and minuses, first of all, they represent changes in fitness or effects of interactions on fitness of different species. Secondly, these things are not definitions. They can't be definitions because, look, parasitism and predation have both the same symbols. But parasitism and predation are two different things. In the case of predation, one species consumes the other species, typically from the outside. In parasitism, one species negatively impacts the fitness of the other species, but there's not necessarily full consumption. And typically, predation involves the killing of the prey. Parasitism doesn't always involve the killing of the host. Finally, parasites usually live within the host over long term, and predation again is sort of a separate entity that consumes the host from the outside. And if we focus on just these three kinds of interactions, oftentimes people tend to put them in strict categories. Parasitism is very different from commensalism, is very different from mutualism, but I want you to think of them as points along a continuum. So imagine that parasitism, a very clear case of parasitism where one species benefits and the other one is harmed. Well, imagine that the harm to that second species is not really that bad. So maybe we've sort of moved along this continuum a little bit more towards commensalism. And through evolution, maybe that second species sort of evolves in a way that allows it to not be harmed by the parasite, in which case the parasite's there, but it's not really having a big effect on the host. So there we've got a case of commensalism. Now imagine again where that second species, instead of being negative or neutral, offers a slight benefit to the other species that it's interacting with. And so that might be a slight mutualism. And over time, evolution might favor that interaction such that both species have a really strong benefit from that interaction. So again, don't think about these as very hard and fast categories, but think about them as something that evolution can sort of shape these interactions and change how species benefit or are harmed because of those interactions. So again, this course is evolutionary ecology. We're talking about ecological interactions here and how evolution shapes the traits of species that leads to different kinds of ecological interactions. So let's talk just a little bit about diversity in parasites. We're going to go through parasites and parasitism first. So parasitism, again, is a case where one species sort of lives within or lives on its host and benefits from it, has increased fitness by being associated with that host, and the host species has a negative impact on its fitness. As we'll see in some of the slides later on, fish do have parasites. All these different kinds of animals and plants have parasites, but some groups of organisms have different loads of parasites. So fish on average don't have very many parasites. Birds have a pretty good number. Average host individual has 7 or so different species of parasite on them. Take a look at mammals, were mammals. Average mammal individual has 14 to 15 species of parasites on them. Creepy. So lots of different kinds of insects are below. They will have a variety of different kinds of parasites on them. Insects are super diverse, but the parasites of insects are also super diverse. Then we get down to trees. There's that little hash mark in the bar because that's off the scale. The average tree has upwards of 95 different species of parasites that consume them. Now we're not thinking about parasites like viruses and bacteria, but certainly trees get those kinds of bacteria, get those sorts of parasites in them. But where a big portion of that parasitic load comes from is from herbivores. And we'll talk about herbivores another time, but I typically think of herbivores as being mostly parasites. Very infrequently are they predators. So lots of different species have parasites. There's a virus going around right now known as SARS-CoV-2. Viruses, many people consider not being alive, but they can be parasites. They live within a host. They have a negative impact on the fitness of the host. They sort of fit the classical, very broad, general definition of what a parasite is. So that's an internal parasite or an endoparasite, because it usually is inside of your body when it's doing its thing. Same thing goes for tapeworms. Tapeworms are endoparasitic. Humans get them, dogs get them, lots of different organisms get them. And then I want you to think about parasites as being on the outside. So from one standpoint, a mosquito that benefits from drinking blood from you is an external parasite or an ectoparasite. And in the lower right you can see that there's a tick that's been feeding on this turtle, and that tick is also an external parasite, much like a mosquito is. So that middle figure has an image of a parasitic snail that has been, has an image of a snail that has been parasitized by a fluke. And there's a link on the Moodle page for you to go to a page where you can see that parasite in action. It's amazing because what it does is it makes this snail have an eye stalk that is very, very conspicuous. It strobes. You have to see the video. It's awesome. So plants can be parasites too. This is an image of a parasitic plant known as dodder, this orange stuff here. And what it does is it taps into the host plant, puts roots into the host plant, and draws products of photosynthesis, so sugars, from its host, and it also draws water from its host. Dodder is an example of a holoparasite. Holo meaning entire or whole. So dodder is the kind of parasite that takes both nutrients and water from its host. Mistletoe, down below, is an example of a hemiparasite, or sort of partial parasite. Mistletoe only takes water from its host tree, but it does photosynthesis on its own, which you can sort of gather because, look, it's green. So mistletoe is a plant, and if you look in trees at the time of year around here where there aren't very many leaves on oak trees and things like that, you'll be able to see mistletoe just growing happily in the crowns of those host trees.